Mark Matheson and Neil Goldsmith, both of whom are also in the Minneapolis office, and Brian Woolley of our Kansas City office. First of all, thank you so much for joining us today so that we can talk with you about some of the pressing issues that are facing employers during this COVID-19 pandemic. Before we launch into the programming content, I just want to cover a few housekeeping matters. First of all, I want to just let you know that we've selected a few hot topics today that we are getting a lot of questions about, but there obviously are a number of other employment and HR and business considerations that you all are having to work through. We've got our all of our Lathrop GPM lawyers regularly tracking legal developments and what's going on, and we've been issuing a number of client alerts. If you're interested in those, please let us know and we can get you added to the list. And another option is to go to the main page of our website. All of those alerts are being loaded at the bottom right-hand corner of the website, and so that's a good place to check periodically to see what new information we've put out. Due to the limited time that we have today and the ambitious agenda, we are not going to be taking Q&A during the presentation. Each of us are, though, in our separate sections planning to try to address some of the most common questions that we are getting from our clients, and you should feel free after the presentation to reach out to any of us with additional questions or advice that you might be looking for. I also want to mention that we had such a large interest in the webinar today that we hit our max attendee capacity with our technology service here. We are going to post the recording of the webinar on our website tomorrow, and so if you have other individuals interested in your organizations who would like to hear it, you should be able to access that recording tomorrow. With that, I'm going to kick us off on the first topic that we are planning to cover here today, and that is talking about the tough decisions that you are having to make around your workforces, their work location, and their work status. So if we could go to the next slide, that would be great. So we're going to work through that technology, and I'm gonna keep going here just to make sure we stay on track, and hopefully we can get the slides caught up here in a second. What we are seeing is that our clients are having to address kind of three primary structures for their workforce, depending on the issues that they are facing and the different legal orders that may be applying to them. So we are seeing a number of employers who are just keeping either all of their employees or some of them on their regular work schedules and at their regular work locations. We are seeing that more commonly for employers that fall into critical service and product areas. Other employers increasingly are having to make alternative arrangements, and partly that is because we have a growing number of states that are issuing shelter-in-place orders that are requiring individuals to stay at home, with the exception of certain businesses that are deemed to be critical infrastructure businesses that provide critical products and services, and those organizations are being told that they actually have a social responsibility to try to stay in full operation. So, you know, unless there is a shelter-in-place order, that is one model that we are seeing, and the model we're also seeing for those critical function employers. We also have a number of employers that are shifting either all or some of their workforce to a remote model, and they might be doing that because they're subject to a shelter-in-place order, and they cannot have employees going to the regular workplace if they don't have an exemption. We also have employers who had started doing that even before shelter-in-place orders, just because it was easier for them to meet their safety requirements and try to proactively prevent exposure and spread by having folks work remotely. We then have a number of employers, and I think a growing number of employers that are starting to have to look at cost savings measures that might include employee reductions or employee terminations. And that can be for any number of reasons. They might have individuals who really cannot work remotely. And unfortunately, there's, as people know, a huge economic fallout that's happening very suddenly from the pandemic that is causing a lot of organizations to suddenly be having financial concerns that are causing them to have to engage in some cost savings measures. There are a number of legal considerations to keep in mind if you are having to engage in cost savings measures, and so I'm going to be talking through those. Before I talk about employee reductions in the form of either terminations or furloughs, I just want to briefly mention that there obviously are cost savings measures that you might implement that might not involve having to terminate employees or having to furlough them on a full-time or partial basis. So we just have a quick slide reminding you what some of those measures may be in case they are things that are helpful to you and might help you reduce the number of employees that you potentially have to furlough or lay off. And so those might be things like hiring freezes, freezing merit increases. If you have discretionary bonus or commission programs that you are not required to pay out, it might be suspending those. It might be restricting contractors where you have less of an obligation to continue to have those people working for you. We certainly have some clients that are reallocating employees to busier or growth opportunity areas where they don't have enough work or any work for them in their regular positions. With non-exempt folks, looking at restricting or eliminating overtime can be helpful. We have some clients who may not be reducing hours and may be looking at some temporary reductions in wages or benefits to try to improve their financial situation. And obviously looking at your budget and whether there's expenses you can trim in other areas is another potential option. Often, though, we find that you go through those measures and you still are not able to get the cost savings effect that you need. And so we are increasingly getting calls from clients who are having to either do reductions in force or furloughs. You're probably familiar with what those terms mean, but just real quickly, obviously a reduction in force would be a full separation of employment where an individual is actually terminated, is no longer employed, and if you were to look to reemploy them in the future, they would have to go through your application process. And in contrast, a furlough is a situation where somebody remains an employee, but you are putting them either voluntarily or involuntarily on a forced, unpaid leave of absence. It might be a full-time leave, or we have some clients who are doing partial furloughs where they are still having people work, but on a reduced hour basis to get a cost savings. You can implement those measures involuntarily, meaning that you, the employer, are making the selections around who's going to be impacted. There also are some opportunities to do voluntary programs. I've had a few clients ask about voluntary furloughs, and that certainly is an option. There may be employees who would prefer to not be working right now. The one thing I will flag about voluntary furloughs is in some states that may impact an employee's eligibility for unemployment comp benefits. And so that's something you'll want to check on as you're assessing what you might want to do. On the separation front, a voluntary option is to consider some sort of voluntary exit incentive program, and that's a program where you are offering severance pay or some other type of benefit that is designed to try to induce people to put their hands up and volunteer to end their employment. I'm not going to go into details today, but I will say those have to be carefully designed. Otherwise, you might get volunteers that are the very people you'd rather retain. And there are some special legal requirements around those types of programs that you need to be mindful of. Most of our clients are doing involuntary furloughs or layoffs. And I'm going to quickly try to pick through the different areas of legal considerations that you should be thinking about in the areas where we are getting the most questions from clients. The first area that I'll talk about is wage and hour considerations. So if you are terminating people, I think everyone is well aware that with respect to wage and hour issues, you have to make sure that you are paying everybody all of their earned wages through whatever their separation is. In the furlough context, though, where you are not terminating people, the things that you want to remember is that non-exempt employees only have to be paid for the time that they are actually working. So you can have them track hours. If they're on a partial furlough or if they're not working at all, they don't have to be paid. Exempt employees are a little bit different. They typically have to be paid their full salary for any work week in which they do any work. And an employer-initiated absence is not an exception to that. And so in light of that, if it's possible, you want to time your furlough for exempt employees to start with a work week. Otherwise, you'll have to pay them a full week's of salary for a partial week. And you really want to be instructing them not to do any work during the furlough. There also are some requirements if you were to be reducing pay due to a partial furlough where somebody is working part-time. So if somebody's exempt, you either need to keep their weekly salary at least that weekly salary exempt level, or there may be some options to temporarily classify people to non-exempt in a documented fashion. And if you're doing that, I'd encourage you to reach out to your lawyer at our firm for assistance. Another thing you want to think about is whether people might be eligible for any paid time off under any of your paid time off policies or any laws while they are out on a furlough. So if we can go to the next slide, the issues there are that you'll want to be checking whether people have individual contracts or collective bargaining, or whether your written time off policies may in fact require you to allow people to use those benefits. Most of the time what we are finding is that policies are written to cover employee-initiated absences, and if that's the case, employers typically do not have to allow the use of time, and some employers don't want to because those payouts can offset the cost savings of the furlough. You can always voluntarily allow the usage of time, but most policies are not drafted to require you to allow people to use that time. It could be, though, that if you've got a policy that was drafted to contemplate furloughs or it has unusual language in it, that you might have pay obligations. You also want to be mindful that your selection of people for layoff or termination needs to be lawful. If you are terminating people or furloughing them, you want to be checking on whether they are at will or whether they might be, the smaller population in your business that has a contract, and whether they have any contract rights that you need to honor. And all of the typical rules that would apply to any adverse action that you might be taking, like non-discrimination rules and anti-retaliation rules, will apply. So when you get a preliminary impact list together, you'll want to make sure that you are vetting that just like you would do in normal circumstances to make sure that you are comfortable that your selections don't carry any legal risk. Another thing that you want to consider are notice obligations. My colleague Neil Goldsmith is going to talk about WARN laws in a minute, so I won't go into detail on that. But I do want to flag for folks that increasingly at the state and local level, we have pay notice laws. I'll use Minnesota as an example since that's where I am located. Last year, Minnesota passed a wage theft law at the state level. That apart from some wage theft provisions also requires all employers to give new hires a very detailed written notice about their schedule and their pay and their benefits. And if information covered by that form changes, then an updated change notice has to be given before the effective date of the change. And a lot of states and counties and cities have similar requirements. And so if you are changing work schedule, pay, and benefits, you very well may have some sort of individualized written notice requirement that you need to honor with your employees. The last thing that I'll do is just flag a couple of other legal things that should be on your checklist. One is benefits and COBRA obligation. If an employee is terminated, that is almost always going to be a COBRA event under your health insurance and often your dental insurance programs. A furlough can also be a COBRA event because many health plans have provisions that employees have to work a certain minimum number of hours to be eligible to participate in the plan as an active participant. And so when people dip below those hours on a full-time or partial furlough, that may trigger a COBRA obligation. I'd encourage you to be reaching out to your benefits brokers and insurers. We are finding here in Minnesota that some carriers are insisting on COBRA notices being issued for furloughs, and some carriers are relaxing those requirements because of the unusual time and the fact that when you have a furlough situation, the goal is to return that person to active employment and active status under the plan. Some other things that you might want to think about are return of property issues. You know, if somebody's terminated, obviously you would do the normal process. If somebody's on a furlough and you don't want them working from home, you may want to require them to leave all company property and computers at the office. I have been advising clients that I would not require employees to take personal belongings home because that doesn't feel consistent with a furlough, but you obviously could allow people the opportunity, assuming that they're still allowed to go to the office site, to gather up belongings that they would like to have at home. The other things on this slide are just reminders of some of the things that may come into play if you are doing a termination, like thinking through whether you're going to offer severance and how to set up that program, making sure you meet final pay requirements. If you have people with confidentiality or non-compete agreements, it's a good idea at the end of employment to send out written reminders of that. And obviously, there are a lot of unemployment benefit implications of these furlough and termination situations, which my colleague Mark Matheson will be addressing a little bit later in the presentation. So with that, I am going to turn things over to my colleague, Neil Goldsmith, who's going to talk with you about WARN issues.
Thank you, Megan. I wanted to talk just briefly about the WARN Act. This will be more of a 20,000-foot view, and just to highlight some of the key considerations that you should be thinking about during these difficult times. The WARN Act is an act that seems to get a lot of attention whenever there's an economic downturn. If companies are engaging in a large number of layoffs, it gets some significant attention, and want you all to be aware of what requirements you may have under this law. The WARN Act generally applies to employers with 100 or more employees. And what the WARN Act requires is a 60-day notice period of any plant closing or mass layoff at a single site of employment. And I've quoted those terms because those are legal terms of art. There's a lot of nuance and legal interpretation surrounding those terms, but for purposes of our discussion today, I just want to focus on the mass layoff piece, which is important for employers to understand. A mass layoff is either a layoff of 500 or more employees, or between 50 and 499 employees if those employees make up at least 1/3 of the total employees at a single site of employment. So, for example, let's say you have 200 employees total across your company, but they're spread out across 10 different facilities, 10 different offices, and there's only 20 people in each of those offices. If you were to lay off every single person, you would actually not trigger any WARN Act requirements, because the key measuring stick is how many employees you have at a single site of employment and how many employees are you letting go at a single site of employment, typically. Keep in mind that some states have mini WARN laws, have their own statutes that largely mirror federal WARN, but also have some of their own requirements, and oftentimes those requirements are stricter. For example, some states might have a 90-day notice requirement. Some states trigger for a mass layoff might be 25 employees, not 50 employees. So that's something to keep in mind. Make sure you're aware of whatever the mini WARN laws are in the states where you are operating. Now, before everyone has a heart attack and thinks that they're automatically subject to WARN and they were required to provide this notice to employees they may have had to lay off or might be laying off soon, I've got some good news for you, and I want to run through some of these exceptions and concepts that I think will lessen a bit of the impact from a WARN perspective. Under the federal WARN law, there's an exception for unforeseeable business circumstances. This is not a very often litigated issue, so there's not a whole lot of case law interpreting what this means. Certainly, there's been no case law applying this to a pandemic situation like the one we have now. However, I and most of the other practitioners out there tend to agree that this would likely qualify as unforeseeable business circumstances, this pandemic that we're in. However, if you are going to claim the unforeseeable business circumstances exception, you still have some requirements. First, you have to provide as much notice as practicable, and you also have to provide a brief statement of the basis for reducing the notification period. In other words, you need to let employees know when their jobs are going to be ending, whether that's immediately, whether that's in a few days, whether that's in a week. Again, that's going to vary by the situation, and I think you'll have a good amount of latitude given how rapidly the information is changing about COVID-19. That being said, I think as the pandemic continues and more states have additional restrictions, you should be thinking about when you might be letting employees go. And if you can provide more than just a few days notice, I would certainly recommend doing that. You also should provide a reason for why they're being let go. I think it's fairly obvious, people understand it, but it's still important to have some sort of written communication to your employees, just in case you do have to take advantage of this unforeseeable business circumstances exception. Another piece of information that might take some companies who would be subject to WARN out of WARN is this 6-month requirement that if employees are rehired within 6 months of being let go, they do not count as employment losses. I understand a number of companies are hoping this is merely temporary and they can hire back, if not everyone, just about all of their workforce once the pandemic dies down. So for example, let's say you had 100 employees at a single site of employment and you had to let go all 100 of them, but within 6 months you've rehired 51 of them, you would not have a WARN Act obligation. Because you've rehired 51, you would only have an employment loss of 49, and you wouldn't trigger a WARN notice obligation. I do want to note that some states, some mini-WARN laws, do not have this unforeseeable business circumstances exception. California and New Jersey are a couple that come to mind. However, California has come out and said that they are going to stay enforcement of all actions under their state WARN law for the next 60 days. So employers in California don't have to worry about not having that exception. Again, you should check in all the states that you're operating and make sure that there is some sort of exception. And if there's not, hopefully there will be some guidance from those other states soon delaying enforcement. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Mark Matheson, who's going to discuss some issues related to unemployment.
Yeah, thank you, Neil. Well, it comes no surprise to anybody that unemployment is a big part of the picture here. We saw the news this morning that last week the new unemployment claims were over 3 million, a record number of new claims, and with things the way that they are, unemployment is a big part of the picture. I want to, first of all, make clear that there in the Families First Coronavirus Act that was signed into law by the president last week, which is Brian will be talking about here in a little while, and that's the law that provides for emergency paid sick leave and an expansion of the FMLA and some paid leave. That law contains an expansion and some federal extended federal funding for unemployment that goes to the state, unemployment money that goes to the states and to the states' unemployment comp systems. You may also have heard in the last 24 hours about the bill that the Senate passed last night, which contains a number of additional unemployment pieces, and but I'm not presenting on those today because that has not been enacted into law yet. My understanding is that it's going to be considered in the House today. I don't know what the House will do with it. And then, of course, when Congress is done, the president would have to sign it. And so the focus here of my talk is based on what's already happened, not what might happen in the future, but what might happen in the future may be even bigger and maybe more important to you and to your employees or former employees or furloughed employees than what has already happened. So in the law that was passed last week, there are emergency federal grants to the states that are conditioned, the grants are conditioned on the states maintaining and strengthening access to the unemployment comp system. And there's some specific provisions that the states have to adopt in order to ease the eligibility requirements and otherwise make access to unemployment compensation easier for employees and laid off or furloughed employees to access. So one is that the traditional waiting week for benefits, which most but not all states have as a feature of the unemployment system, that has to be waived so that benefits would be payable from the very first day that a person is unemployed. Also, there's the states have to relax or waive the work search requirements. Normally, in order to be eligible to receive or continue to receive unemployment compensation, an employee has to be, a former employee has to be looking actively for work and be available for work. But that requirement has to be waived or largely waived by the states in order to receive these federal funds. And then for these, if there's an expansion of benefits, in this instance for the COVID, I mean, this is all applicable to COVID-19 unemployment circumstances, unemployment that's caused by, in one way or another, by the pandemic. Those benefits will not be charged to an employer's experience rating for purposes of the unemployment tax. Now, there is a difference. Some nonprofit employers have the option to elect not to pay an unemployment tax, but rather to reimburse the state dollar for dollar for unemployment benefits that are paid to their former employees. For reimbursing employers, this non-chargeability does not currently apply. That's one of the things that this law that the Senate passed last night would address that at least to a degree. There's also activity on the Minnesota level to address that problem, but it has currently, if you're a nonprofit reimbursing employer, you would be charged even for COVID-19 related benefits. We can go to the next slide. And then and in Minnesota, the Minnesota governor adopted or issued an executive order that does adopt essentially these standards, and I'm using that as an example. I'm not, haven't done a 50-state survey to see which states have already adopted this, but many of them might. Now, particularly with what's coming in this new bill that the Senate passed, it's highly likely that the states, most states at least, will be adopting these sort of relaxed and modified standards. The standards in the executive order of the Minnesota governor apply in all of these three cases that you see in the bullets on this slide. A healthcare professional or health authorities recommended that the individual, or I think it can be everybody, avoid contact with others, and or they've been ordered not to come to work due to the outbreak of a communicable disease, or they've been notified by a school district or a daycare that care or school is not available, and they've made reasonable effort to replace that, and they request time off as an accommodation. In all of those circumstances, unemployment benefits would in fact be payable. And again, I understand that broadly. In Minnesota, yesterday, the governor issued a stay-at-home order. Of course, in New York or California, there have been other names for these orders, but basically, it seems that a person's going to be eligible for unemployment, at least in Minnesota and in other states that act similarly, if any of these conditions apply. Okay, the next slide. I want to just note that although there's no under the Minnesota example or the requirements of the emergency funding that was passed and is being made available, although there's no waiting week, the receipt of vacation pay or sick pay or personal time off, any kind of pay makes the person ineligible while they're receiving that pay. So if a person is eligible, if they take paid sick leave, emergency paid sick leave under the new federal law, or the employer allows them to take PTO or vacation, what have you, then that will affect their eligibility for benefits. And that's something that employers are going to want to think about when you're sort of syncing up your activities. When do I furlough somebody, or when do I lay somebody off? And am I trying to avoid a duty to pay emergency sick leave, or am I trying to optimize what an employee might be entitled to? Those are things you will need to think through. And so then I go on. This is another condition, this work search condition. That the funding law says on the one hand that applicants have to seek suitable work as long as, but not work that poses a risk to health or safety, their health or the health of others, and then employees who are temporarily laid off or who are furloughed can meet the work search requirements just by staying in contact with the current employer. And what I've been recommending to clients is that they help enable employees to do that by just ensuring that at the point of departure, at the point of the temporary furlough or layoff, that they have updated contact information so that the employer and employee can stay in touch with each other. This unemployment insurance stabilization is what was passed last week. Again, this is at no cost to the employer, doesn't affect the tax rate. It does apply to certain business owners, and to the extent there's any question about who is or who isn't going to be eligible under this expanded sort of COVID-19 unemployment, in Minnesota anyway, and this would be consistent with conditions in the Emergency Federal Funding Act, that Minnesota is encouraging anybody who thinks they might be eligible, anybody who's become unemployed or partially unemployed, to go online and apply for benefits and sort of frankly see what happens. And then the governor, Minnesota governor's executive order, again, this is consistent with or in accordance with the requirements of the federal law, that strict compliance with the unemployment statute will not be required. We can go to the next slide, which is our last slide, and this is about shared work. Many clients have asked, and this is something that's contemplated in, I know it's in the Senate, the bill the Senate passed last night, shared work or short-time compensation programs. These have been around for 10 years or more, and they depend in part on federal funding. The idea is that instead of laying people off, you reduce hours and keep everybody working, but just not as many hours a week. Under the Minnesota order, at least, it doesn't, my take on this has been not clear that there's a reason to use one of these programs, because I think that that employees may get the same unemployment benefits now without adopting one of these programs, but that still remains to be seen. That may not be the full and complete analysis, especially if this new Senate law or bill becomes law, because again, it encourages the use of these programs. But the idea is that you reduce hours 10 to 60%, and those people who would be then who are having their hours so reduced would be eligible for unemployment benefits on a pro rata basis, and basically staying in touch with that employer will likely meet the work search test. So again, there's more and perhaps bigger relief coming from the feds, but this is what we have now. And I think one of the key takeaways is you will need to consider as the employer what you want to have happen and how you expect perhaps unemployment benefits to integrate with other emergency leave or other payouts that you do or don't allow for your employee. And then now I'm going to turn it back to Neil, who's going to talk about a little bit about the EEOC guidance on the pandemic circumstances.
Thank you, Mark. So we've been focusing a lot on terminations, furloughs, layoffs, unemployment, changing in employment status. For those of you who are fortunate enough to be operating with still a large number of employees who are working, and particularly those employers who have employees working in a physical working space, this is going to be really important for you because the EEOC has laid out some recent guidance answering some but not all common questions that a lot of companies were having in terms of what can they do in terms of making sure that their employees are safe without running afoul of the ADA. So there's a general duty under OSHA to maintain a safe workplace for all of your employees. And obviously, safety is going to be paramount at a time like this. You want to do whatever you can to keep your employees safe. However, that can run up against some ADA requirements. The ADA generally prohibits making disability-related inquiries of your employees and of applicants, and also generally prohibits requiring medical examinations, with a few exceptions. One of the exceptions I want to talk about is the most applicable one here, which is the direct threat exception, where the EEOC has come out and said that these general prohibitions more or less can be suspended if there is a direct threat regarding the safety of the employees at your workforce. Up until about a week or so ago, we had to rely on previous guidance from 2009 that the EEOC issued in conjunction with the H1N1 outbreak. That guidance was somewhat applicable to COVID-19, but it certainly didn't answer all the questions that employers had regarding what they could and could not do, what they could and could not ask of their employees, and the big question of whether or not COVID-19 constitutes a direct threat, whether or not COVID-19 is a pandemic. What the previous guidance basically said was if you're experiencing a pandemic, that is a direct threat, and some of these rules and restrictions may be relaxed. Fortunately, the EEOC came out with new guidance, which was last updated March 21st, which confirmed that COVID-19 is a direct threat, at least in its current form, that COVID-19 is a pandemic. So how does that change things? Well, some of the questions that the EEOC guidance answered were the following. Can I send my employees home if they display symptoms? Yes, you can. EEOC guidance makes that clear. How much information can I request from employees who call in sick? Well, a fair amount is the answer. If someone is calling in sick, you can essentially ask them whether or not they are experiencing symptoms of COVID-19. And the symptoms they specifically call out in the guidance are fever, chills, cough, shortness of breath, or sore throat. So that's a question you can ask of your employees if they're calling in sick. Employees' temperatures. This was the big question that I first got maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, and my answer was a resounding no, or a resounding no, you can't, but if you really want to take on that risk, you can, but there's a lot of risk associated with it. Because the situation has changed so rapidly and so drastically, the EEOC specifically came out and said, yes, you may now take employees' temperatures before they enter your workforce. Obviously, there's a host of other issues that go along with that. It may or may not be the best practice for your particular company. There's some complications in terms of how to actually administer those tests. But the EEOC has said that given that we are in a pandemic situation, they will allow employers to test and take temperatures. Can you ask where employees have traveled? Yes, that was true now, and it was true before. And the EEOC guidance essentially states, well, that's not a disability-related inquiry, so you can certainly ask uh, where employees have traveled. You can ask if they've traveled to any part of the country that is particularly more at risk, or if they've traveled to places like Italy, Iran, China, and it doesn't matter whether it's business or personal travel. You can inquire about both. Can I ask employees without symptoms if they have a medical condition that would make them more susceptible to COVID-19? So, as we know, the elderly are more susceptible. People with other conditions such as diabetes or cancer are more susceptible to this. So can we ask our employees who aren't showing symptoms if they have any of these conditions? The EEOC on this has still said no. No, you cannot inquire about their medical conditions. Certainly if they want to volunteer that, if they want to self-disclose, you can take that information into account, but you cannot uplink it, ask that question. Can I require employees to work remotely? Yes, is the answer. Obviously, many companies are doing that. And I'd say not only is that allowed, but I'd say it's probably encouraged if it's possible to set that up. Can I require a doctor's note before allowing employees to return to work? The answer is yes. However, the EEOC mentions that as a practical matter, it might be highly unlikely for an employee to actually obtain a very detailed doctor's note regarding their specific status as it regards to COVID-19, just given the huge strain that the healthcare system is under currently. And what the EEOC has recommended, and what I'm recommending to my clients as well who've asked this question, is essentially get as much documentation as you can, and understand that you might not have the most fulsome documentation that you're used to. Get as much documentation as you can, and then make decisions based off that, and obviously err on the side of employee rights and err on the side of workplace safety as well. One last piece that the guidance also addressed was about hiring employees. What do we do if we're in a situation where we've got employees who are ready to start, or if you're in a fortunate position where you need to hire and have work and need to increase your ranks? The EEOC has said that employers can screen applicants for COVID-19 with a couple important exceptions or requirements. First, it needs to be only at the conditional offer stage, meaning you cannot be asking someone about their COVID-19 status at an application or initial interview stage. You should wait until you're ready to give the offer to the person, and then make it conditional upon making sure that they are not COVID-19 positive or not susceptible to contracting COVID-19. Same kind of rules apply for employees in the workplace. You want to make sure, obviously, these applicants are safe to workplace as well. You also want to make sure that your screening is uniform, that you're not just picking and choosing which applicants you are asking to screen. For example, you should not only be asking elderly or people that may have the condition or may appear to have a condition. You want to make sure you are applying that consistently with everyone in a given job classification. And the EEOC has also said that employers can withdraw offers and delay start dates to symptomatic individuals or work. Well, I hope everyone has enjoyed the undercurrent of this fight. At this point, I want to hand it over to Brian Woolley, who will be handling the main event and something that I know that is on everyone's mind, which is the Families First Act.
Thanks, Neil. And with that introduction, I feel like I should say, let's get ready to rumble. But the Families First Coronavirus Response Act was passed quickly through the House and Senate and signed into law just over a week ago. The purpose of the law seems clear: get money in the hands of people who are taking time off work for coronavirus-related reasons. It does this in two ways. First piece is the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Law, and the second piece is an expansion of the existing Family and Medical Leave Act. We'll talk about each separately, but first, there are a couple things that the two pieces have in common. For both pieces, the effective date is April the 1st. And no, this is not an April Fool's joke. it is April the 1st. There was some earlier thought that maybe it was going to be April 2nd based on some hints the Department of Labor had given us. But officially on Tuesday, they came out and said April 1 is the effective date. It also, both of the laws expire December 31, 2020. So these are both short-term fixes, at least for now, at least unless Congress extends it. Another thing that the two have in common is that they only apply to employers with fewer than 500 employees. Except for government agencies, it also applies to certain government agencies, and it applies to them regardless of how large they are. So when we talk about the 500 employee limit, that's for private employers. For private employers, if you have more than 500 employees, this does not apply to you. If you're right around 500 and mentally counting to see whether this is going to apply, a couple things to think of. You count both full-time and part-time employees. An employee is an employee for purposes of this. And you count as of the time a person wants to take a leave. So basically, as of April 1st, you want to look and see if you have 500 or not. And if nobody wants to take leave then if somebody wants to take some later the next week or whatever, then you would count. And also, if you're close to the line, there are also some nuanced things you need to be aware of, which would apply, again, just to a relatively few number of companies that are right in that threshold, right around 500. If you are there, you want to take a look at some of the guidance that's come out because there are a couple of nuances on how you count. A third, and perhaps the most important common feature of these two leaves is that they're paid, which means they're paid by the employer with a mechanism for government reimbursement we'll talk about in a minute. How much is that pay? Well, it varies depending on the reason for the leave, and so we'll talk about that when we're talking about the specific leave. So let's go on to the next slide and talk about the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Law, okay? The EPSL. They passed these laws quickly because they did not take the time to come up with clever acronyms for them. They just went with what makes what's easy and slapped it on there, and here we go. So for emergency paid sick leave, this applies if an employee is unable to work or unable to telework due to the need for leave for one of 6 reasons. And they kind of fall in 2 categories, which is why I've got the 2 slides up. So if the employee needs to take leave because they are subject to a federal, state, or local quarantine or isolation order. Second reason would be if they've been advised by a healthcare provider to self-quarantine, or if they're experiencing COVID-19 symptoms and seeking a medical diagnosis. So those are sort of health-related reasons. Another reason for that would make someone eligible for the emergency paid sick leave is if they are caring for an individual who is subject to a quarantine order or subject to a doctor's order. And also, and this is probably the one that's going to impact most employers the most, it's going to apply if the employee is taking leave to care for a son or daughter whose school or daycare is closed because of COVID-19. So again, all of these leave triggers have to be related to COVID-19. They do not apply if the employee can telework, and that makes sense because if the employee is teleworking, they're getting paid by their employer, and so they don't need the paid leave. There's also no waiting period for the employee paid sick leave law. The employee is eligible for this on day 1 of their employment. A couple of questions we're getting on this. Let's say you're an employer who already gives employees paid sick leave. And the answer is, well, good for you, but this employee emergency paid sick leave is in addition to your existing benefits. You cannot force an employee to use your benefits first before they take advantage of the emergency paid. The other question we're getting on this, is, does a government shelter in place or shutdown order that applies to the entire community or the entire state, does that qualify as a federal order for isolation or quarantine, which is one of the triggers? And the answer to that is probably not, maybe not, because it's, again, a general order and not specifically related to any health-related concern for an individual. It's one of those things where there's a lot of disagreement, and it's a question that a lot of people have. We're hopeful that the Department of Labor will answer that in some of their guidance that's going to be coming out here, we think, in the next few days. So how much leave do you get on the emergency paid sick leave? It's a maximum of 80 hours. That's for a full-time employee. For a part-time employee, you can prorate it. And how much money do you get for someone who's on the emergency pay? How much do you have to pay as the employer? Well, it depends on the reason. If the person is gone because of the quarantine order or the doctor's advice or they're showing symptoms, they're entitled to their full regular rate of pay capped at $511 a day. If it's due to caring for another individual or for a school or daycare closing reason, they're only entitled to 2/3 of their regular rate, capped at $200. So if it's an illness issue or a quarantine issue for the employee themselves, they get their full pay up to the $511 cap. If it's to care for someone else, either another individual who's ill or for a school or daycare closing, they only get 2/3 of their pay, capped at $200. All right, so that's the summary of the emergency paid sick leave. Let's go on to the Family and Medical Leave Act expansion. We call it expansion because it adds another qualifying reason for an employee to be eligible to take up to 12 weeks of Family and Medical Leave Act leave. And the qualifying event that this adds is only for the closing of a school or daycare, which requires the employee to stay home to care for a son or daughter. So that's why we've only got the school bus slide here. The school-related or daycare-related closure is the only thing that gets you to the Family and Medical Leave Act expansion. Again, it's not available if the employee can telework. An important eligibility difference between this expansion and other regular Family and Medical Leave Act leave is that this is available, this expanded leave is available to any employee as long as they've worked for you for 30 days. You have to work for a year and work at least 1,250 hours. It applies to other kinds of Family and Medical Leave Act leave. That does not apply here. Also, the rule under other kinds of FMLA leave that the employee has to work in a facility where there's at least 50 employees, that does not apply here. The only qualifying circumstance is that the employee has worked for you for 30 calendar days. Another important change, obviously, from regular FMLA is that this leave, this expanded leave, is paid at least partially. The first 2 weeks are unpaid. After that, up to 10 weeks are paid, and it's paid at 2/3 of the regular rate with a cap of up to $200 a day. So if you've been following along and you saw the 2 school buses, under the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act, if the person's taking leave because of a school or daycare closure, they're paid at 2/3 up to $200 a day. The same kind of reason that lets you take the Family and Medical Leave Act leave, and it's the same pay rate, 2/3 up to $200 a day. The Department of Labor actually sees them working together. The first 2 weeks of the FMLA expansion is unpaid, so someone can use their emergency paid sick leave to cover that 2 weeks of time, and that way they end up with 12 weeks paid for a school closure or a daycare. And the recent Department of Labor guidance is clear that that's the way they anticipate it working, that the employee who's gone because of a school or daycare closure is only entitled to a total of 12 weeks between the two, between the paid sick leave and the FMLA. The paid sick leave, if you're old enough to remember Tetris and how that worked, the emergency paid sick leave sort of Tetrises in to cover the first 2 weeks of the Family and Medical Leave Act expansion that otherwise would be. All right, the next one then, Neil. One other common feature between these 2 laws is that there's a posting required for all covered employers. And on the screen, there's the web address to be able to get the poster, which the Department of Labor published yesterday. And so we'll leave this up for a minute so you can write that down if you want. or otherwise, if you go to the Department of Labor website, dol.gov, there's all kinds of coronavirus information there, including these required posters under the Families First Coronavirus Recovery Act. All right, so those are the basics. Now, how is this really going to work? As Megan said at the beginning, we're not taking questions, but we're kind of asking questions. And so I'm literally going to do that. I'm going to ask myself questions that I've been getting from clients and hopefully are helpful to you. So hopefully I won't stump myself. Question, our company has under 50 employees. We're exempt from these laws, right? Then the answer is maybe. There's a potential exemption based on financial difficulty. If complying with this law is going to impact the financial viability of a company, there's a potential exemption. What the Department of Labor has said is they're going to issue guidance and criteria to tell you whether as a small employer you are able to qualify for the exemption. They do not want anybody to send in an application asking them, is my company exempt? They said that in bold letters in their guidance. They want you as an employer to look at the criteria, document whether you comply, and if you think you do, then you can tell your employees you're not going to allow the emergency paid sick leave or the expanded FMLA, but keep your documentation, because after this is all over, you might get audited. So that's the 50 employee exemption. Let's talk a little bit about the tax credits or the reimbursement for this. So the question is, how is the employer going to get paid for this if the government's and the non-tax lawyer answer is this. If you pay out any money under either of these two new leave laws, then when you run your payroll on all of your employees, normally you've got FICA that you withhold from the employee's tax or employee's pay, and you've got federal income taxes that you withhold from the employee's pay, and those amounts are sent into the federal government along with the employer's match of FICA tax. Under this law, you will be able to keep that money. You don't send it into the government up to the amount of the paid leave that you paid out. And if those withholdings don't cover it for you, then there will be a process that the IRS will refund or pay you back for the balance. It's something that you ought to be talking to your payroll provider, make sure that they're getting the information they need to know how much you have paid out, so they know how much to send to you instead of to the government. But that's the mechanism, and that's, I'm not sure how quick it will be, but it'll certainly be quicker than having to apply to the government to get paid for it, waiting for them. All right, so here's another question. Not-for-profits are exempt for this, right? They do good work, so they shouldn't have to comply. And the answer to that is no. There's no exception for not-for-profits unless you happen to fall under the under 50 and use that exemption, or if you have more than 500 employees, and then just like everybody else, what about this? I've already had to lay people off because business has dried up. Will I have to pay these leaves starting April the 1st to people who are already on layoff? And the answer is, we think probably not. The reason the person is off work is because you laid them off. It's not because of one of the triggers that we talked about earlier for either the Emergency Paid Sick Leave or for the Expanded Family Medical Leave Act. And the guidance from the Department of Labor says these laws are not retroactive. But that's all they say. They don't explain what they mean by that. So right now, we would say that anybody who's off work now is not going to be eligible to receive these payments while they remain off after April 1st. But we know that there are many people advocating to change that because employers have had to move so quickly that there are a lot of people on layoff and already, and there may be some movement in that we'll have to watch for. Can I require a doctor's note or a medical certification? Neil covered that one, so I'm not going to ask. No, I take that back. Under the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Law, there is no provision for certification. So there's no requirement that the employee provides you with any kind of medical service. What if an employee doesn't use all 80 of their emergency paid sick leave hours? The answer is you do not have to pay them for unused time, and that time does not carry over to the next year after. And one other short one is because I see we're at 1 o'clock. One other short one. What if the employee has already used 12 weeks of FMLA leave during this year? Are they entitled to another 12 weeks under the expanded FMLA law? And if you read the law, it is an amendment to the existing FMLA, which has the limitation that only 12 weeks within a year is the maximum leave that any employee is entitled to for whatever reason. And so if you read it literally, the answer is if they've already used 12 weeks, they're not entitled to 12 more. I've got to believe that the Department of Labor is, in their guidance, is going to come out and say anybody who's off because of coronavirus issues needs to get paid, because that's really the whole purpose. So obviously there are way many more questions that we could ask and answer. There's also a lot of questions we could ask and not answer yet. Hopefully we'll see more information from the Department of Labor between now and April 1st. But with that, I want to thank you all for attending. I hope we were able to give you some guidance to help you navigate these difficult times. Stay healthy and stay safe. Thank you.